All right, let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me all right? All the way in the back, the cheap seats? All right, good. My name is Jonathan J. Tower. I go by J for short. We're going to talk today about is ASP.NET Core ready for prime time? Hold on a second while I get my clicker working right. All right, it's still doing right clicking. There we go, okay. So we're going to talk about ASP.NET and whether Core and whether it's ready for prime time yet. Show of hands, at least those who are in the room with me here, who is using ASP.NET Core already for a real application, like a production application? Okay, it looks like maybe 40-ish%, I would guesstimate, not scientifically. That's good to know. For the rest of us, I assume many of us have bosses that we have to convince that it's worth doing rework or new work to move things over to ASP.NET Core. So hopefully I'm going to give you some ammunition today that'll help you with that. A little about me, I'm a founding partner and principal consultant at Trailhead Technology Partners. We're a custom software shop, so if there's anything that you or your company that you're working for might need help with and you'd like to talk to me afterwards or connect with me in one of these places online, I'd be happy to talk to you about that. I'm also a Microsoft MVP in ASP.NET, which if you're not familiar with the MVP program, it's Microsoft's award that they give to experts that use their expertise to give back in the community. So sharing things like this with you today is what they were trying to recognize with that. Talking about ASP.NET Core is right in my sweet spot and something I'm very passionate and interested in. So hopefully you pick up on that a little bit today. I also organize another conference in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where I'm from, called Beer City Code. If you're not familiar with the microbrewery scene, you might not be familiar with Grand Rapids being kind of a hub of that. But if you like beer, or if you like software conferences, or if you like both, we'd love to have you come up on June 1st. Tickets are on sale right now. It's very inexpensive. And then I saw some of you taking pictures already of that GitHub link. As you probably have figured out already, that's where all these slides and code are going to be located afterwards, if you'd like to check that out in more detail. Also, because I do this as just kind of a way to give back, there's been people who've fed into my career over the years, either to like a one-to-many situation like we're in right now, or in a one-to-one situation. I do this as a way to give back, but in a larger sense, all of us are kind of lucky to be in an industry and a country where we're all paid very well for our skills. Hopefully a lot of us have some disposable income. There's about 1 billion people who don't have even access to clean water. That causes all kinds of other problems for them related to health and poverty and kind of being stuck in those. So this is an issue that's close to my heart. So if there's anything useful that I talk about today, if you want to go to that bit.ly link right there, which is bit.ly/stirtrek-water. And I promise I won't be mad if you're on your phone during my talk. If you go to that link and donate some money, you'll see this little progress bar up in the top of my slides update. Hopefully my internet connection is working. You'll see that update throughout my talk. If you guys hit $500 while I'm talking today, I will put my money where my mouth is and match that $500. So in a sense, if you hate everything I say and it's a total waste of your time, you want to cost me $500, you should also donate. Okay. So we'll check about halfway through and see how we're doing on that. So question we're asking, is ASP.NET Core ready for prime time? Yep. All right, thanks for coming. Any questions? All right, good. Just kidding, but also not, because this is basically my short version of my talk here. If you want to go see another talk now, you can go catch the rest of it. But I want to now kind of unpack that a little bit and give you some of the specifics of why I think that's true. Before we do that, though, I think it would be helpful to kind of all get on the same page with the history of ASP.NET and ASP.NET Core. So I'm going to kind of talk through the history real quick here. Anybody been following ASP.NET Core since it was called ASP.NET vNext? Okay, some of us, yep. So those of us that just raised our hands are probably the ones that are feeling the most burned by some of the changes that have happened over that history. So let's talk a little bit about that. It's been quite a few years, actually. May 2014 is when vNext was announced. And the name actually got changed just under a year later in February of 2015 to ASP.NET 5, which was the next version after ASP.NET 4, which was the current version out at the time. And during that time, there was a whole bunch of K stuff built into ASP.NET Core. So there was K, there was a KRE, a Kestrel, KPN, KVM, all these K things, because at this time, the project's internal name was Project K, and so a lot of things that kind of came out of it started with a K. That's not a really great, like, ready for production kind of marketing name, and so when they renamed things to ASP.NET 5, right around that same time frame, all those K things turned into DN things, which was supposed to be like .NET. So there was DN VM, the DNX, DNU. It was still kind of overcomplicated, and the ASP.NET team discovered that the .NET team and them were both developing some of these command line tooling things at the same time to do a lot of the same things. And so right about the time that the name changed to ASP.NET Core 1.0 in January of 2016, they rebranded all that stuff, merged it, rewrote it, and it's now what we call the .NET CLI, or command line interface. So all of that stuff that did version control, NuGet packages, building, running, your .NET Core applications, all of that stuff at the command line is now under the .NET command line, one single entry point. So that kind of got cleaned up, but there was a lot of chaos as things were changing names and getting merged and moved around. But then the other big thing that happened there is when they changed from ASP.NET 5 to ASP.NET Core 1.0, there was a lot of kind of thinking behind that those of us that, first of all, those of us that had used ASP.NET MVC 5, which was the current version of MVC at the time, might be a little confused by ASP.NET 5 when there was already an MVC 5. The other thing, and this might be the bigger reason, is that .NET Core and ASP.NET Core were all rewritten from scratch, cross-platform, from the ground up with performance in mind. And really, in a large sense, it was a revolution, not an evolution of ASP.NET. So they wanted to both keep the name the same to kind of not scare us into thinking like this is some new thing that I'm going to have to learn from scratch. It's nothing like ASP.NET or anything like that. So they wanted to keep the ASP.NET in there, but they also wanted to say, but it's kind of a new thing. We're starting over from scratch, and so that's where the Core 1.0 comes from in there. So just a little bit later in November of 2017, they released Core 1.1, ASP.NET Core 1.1. This is where probably the next most confusing change happened. So before this point, they had said, hey, let's modernize the project file and change it to a project.json file. And everybody said that was cool, except for about 80% of people who said that's not cool. And all my MS build stuff doesn't work anymore. And there's a whole bunch of the community who said, oh, we'd really like CSproj and VBproj to still work. So in between 1.0 and 1.1, they worked on that and actually kind of reversed course and reintroduced the CSproj and VBproj files so that your projects, your ASP.NET Core projects, were still the same. The project.json file went away. And of course, everyone like me who was an early adopter was like, oh boy, they keep pulling this carpet out from under us, right? Good news, 2.0 came out in August of 2017, so not, oh, I've got that date wrong. One of those dates is wrong. I think the 1.0 is supposed to be November 2016, sorry about that. 2.0 came out the next year, and 2.0 is really significant because it actually implements .NET Standard 2.0. If you're not familiar with the .NET Standard, it's basically a standard of the APIs that need to be implemented by a .NET platform. So if you think about like Mono, Unity, .NET Framework, .NET Core, et cetera, all these different like flavors of .NET that we have in the world today. .NET Standard basically says these different versions, if they implement a certain guaranteed set of APIs, then they implement a certain version of the .NET Standard. Well, .NET Standard 2.0 is all of the, if you think of it basically as everything you're familiar with from like .NET Framework 4.7, which isn't that long ago, right? If you think of all the APIs and the base class libraries that you're used to using in that time frame, all of those are what makes up .NET Standard 2.0. So .NET Core 2.0 came out in this time frame and implemented all of those. And basically, at that point, anything that you had to write rewrite because you couldn't use some of the APIs that were missing earlier in .NET Core. Now all of that stuff was included, so that's a pretty significant change. Another significant one for ASP.NET developers was 2.1, where SignalR came back into Core. Before that point, SignalR was kind of experimental and wasn't fully supported in .NET Core yet. So that was a pretty significant update. 2.2, bunch of just like nice polished things. For example, the Open API standard was implemented. So if anyone's familiar with Swagger, the old name for the Open API standard, that is something that was added in 2.2. And then 3.0 is what we have coming up in the second half of this year. And if you watch Build or if you go to Build, you'll probably hear a lot more detail about what's happening with that and the specific dates that that's happening. But as you can tell, like there was a lot of really rough changes earlier on that were really difficult for developers. But in these last few versions, especially since 2.0, things have really stabilized quite a bit. We're really just getting new features at this point, and we're not having that carpet pulled out from under us anymore. So based on that, I would say we're not really in a cutting edge scenario anymore. We're in a more stable scenario. Okay, so some of the reasons I think you could use to talk to your boss about using ASP.NET Core in your applications. First one, .NET is now open source. If you didn't know that, I don't know which rock you've been living under for the last 10 years. But .NET Core is also open source. A whole bunch of other stuff is open source that is .NET related as well. In fact, the majority of it. And one of the kind of cool things about this is that all of that stuff now belongs to something called the Dotnet Foundation, which isn't just like some sort of a shadow version of Microsoft or something. It's legitimately run by people representing all of these different companies here. This is called the Technical Steering Group for .NET Foundation. And you see names like Red Hat and Google in there, for example, which maybe in some past world would have been sort of natural enemies with .NET, right? So we had that dichotomy of open source versus enterprise, Java and .NET and stuff like that. That really is gone now. Microsoft's really embraced the open source and all the benefits that come with that. Along with that, there's so much in the .NET ecosystem that now belongs to the .NET Foundation, which is actually a nonprofit organization spun off, separate from Microsoft, that now legally owns all of these things like .NET Core, Entity Framework, JSON.NET was donated, and all of these projects and many others. So one of the great things about that is now the .NET Foundation has the backing of Microsoft and some of these other companies, as well as the actual developer community like you and me. And that means that you can actually rely on these things and use them in your applications without worrying that there's no energy behind them. So when .NET Foundation actually sponsors something, it's a very legitimate and long-term project. Another huge reason for using ASP.NET Core is performance. One of these graphs is new and one of these is old, so let me talk through these a second. The lines, the line graph here on the left, this is kind of an old one. I haven't seen any new versions of this that have been released. So this was actually released during the 1.0 release candidate 1, I believe. So this is getting back quite a few years now. But if you can read it, way down on the bottom, there's ASP.NET 4. It's basically that orange dot in the very bottom corner there. So that's requests per second. All right, so that's ASP.NET 4 running on Mono. And then if you see the blue and the orange line, that is the early versions of ASP.NET Core 1.0 running on Linux and Windows. The orange line is Linux and the blue line is Windows. So you can see that just out of the box here, even before 1.0 was fully released, the requests per second was orders of magnitude faster than ASP.NET 4 was. Now, if you look at the bottom one, this is a much more recent one, and you can see ASP.NET Core at the time of this screenshot was doing just over 7 million requests per second. So things have improved quite a bit since then. So you can only imagine how low down on the graph ASP.NET 4 might look now if we were to graph it that way again. But you can also see, and this is the really interesting part to me, that ASP.NET Core is third on this particular list of fastest frameworks. Now this is changing every time they rerun this benchmark. It moves up and down a little bit, and as you can kind of see there in that like 6.9 million to 7 million range is kind of where there's a tight packing at the top. But this wasn't the case at all 5 years ago with ASP.NET 4. If you were an ASP.NET developer, you could not say, I am working on one of the fastest frameworks available for the web. You couldn't even kind of close to say that. So that's kind of exciting. Microsoft now says performance is a feature. Another great thing, you can see here if you're in the room with me that I'm using a Mac today. I happen to be running Windows on it at the moment, but if you're a Mac person or if you're that one guy that has a Linux laptop for some reason, you can develop .NET stuff on those, no problem. If you like to use Visual Studio, that's great. You're welcome to do that. You can use it on Windows. There's Visual Studio for Mac for quite a few different .NET project types. There's also Visual Studio Code and all the command line tools that work Linux, Mac, and Windows. So the story is a really nice story here for anybody that wants to develop anywhere, on anything, using any tools. All right, let's actually look at a demo of this. Okay. And let me see if I can make that bigger. Nope. Let me just do this. Okay. All right, so here I am at the Windows subsystem for Linux. Anybody else have this on their computer? Like to use the bash shell? So this is how easy it is. I'm going to make a directory here. I'm just going to call it .NET, and then I'm going to change directory into that. And if I list, you can, whoops. If I list here, you can see that there's nothing in the directory at the moment. I'm going to use the .NET command, and I'm going to say I want to do a new project, and I'm going to use the MVC template. Okay, so this is going to go do a bunch of stuff now and go getting NuGet packages and such. And you can see it restoring, doing a .NET restore right now, which is basically pulling down NuGet packages. And now if I list here, you can see a bunch of stuff that looks more like what you would see in a new project in like Visual Studio. And I'm now going to do .NET run. And I'll zoom back out here because it's going to pop up a browser for me in a second. And so here I am actually in the Linux subsystem, which is really equivalent to being in sort of a Linux machine. And you can see that it's now listening on port 5000. So if I open up my browser and go to 5000, I now am running ASP.NET Core application on Linux. It's that easy. All right, let's close this down. So not only can you develop on all these different platforms, but you can actually host your application on all these different platforms as well. So in the old days, if you were an ASP.NET developer, you could host on any operating system you wanted as long as it was Windows and IIS, right? Now you can actually choose. So in a lot of cases, Linux hosting is a lot cheaper, probably mostly because of licensing things, than Windows hosting. So if you've got a host that you like, or maybe you already have a Linux server that you're using for some other technology, you want to be able to use that to host your ASP.NET applications, or you want to go in the cloud and use Linux VMs. All of that stuff is possible. You don't have to use IIS anymore. You can use Apache or Nginx, or kind of your web server of choice, and you can host your application in any of those places. Not only can you host it on any different operating system, but you can also now host ASP.NET applications in containers. This is kind of huge because that was really not possible before. In fact, SQL Server has, since this all started with ASP.NET Core 1, SQL Server has now moved to Linux and is now also supporting containers. So if you wanted to do like a whole Microsoft stack of technologies and host it in Docker on Linux, you could totally do that now, which, you know, if you've been doing .NET development for very long, probably blows your mind a little bit because it's so hard to imagine 5 or 6 years ago that would be possible. And I want to actually show you a quick demo of doing that. So let's switch back over here to my Visual Studio a second. And I'm going to do you guys all a favor and change my theme to the light theme so that you can actually see it. Here we go. Okay, so while that's changing, let's talk about this project a little bit. So I've got I've got a solution here with a few different projects. I want to start out with this containers project. So literally all I did here was I created a new MVC project just by doing, file, new project, like we often do in Visual Studio. And then you can actually right-click on the project. This is also offered to you in the setup wizard when you're creating your new project. It'll say, hey, do you want Docker support for this or not? But let's say you didn't say yes initially. You can actually come here to the Add menu and pick Docker support right here. And when you do that, it's going to ask you what type of container. Do you want a Windows or a Linux container? As you can see, it's pre-selected Linux, and that's because I already set this up for a Linux container. So I'm just going to cancel that and just show you the Docker file here. So you can see it basically generated this Docker file for me with all of the correct settings. So you don't have to necessarily be a Docker file expert to do this. And then one kind of interesting thing here, you can see in Visual Studio up at the top, if you can read that, instead of saying IIS Express, it actually says Docker. So if I run that now, it's going to do all the work to create my container and compile my code and put it into it. And then it's going to launch the browser for me. And here you can see I'm running a containerized ASP.NET Core application, and it just took me a few clicks to do it. Just in case you're one of those skeptical types, I'm going to do Docker PS here so we can see. So there's this Zealous Williams is the name of my container. I love that name. So if I do .NET kill, Zealous Williams. Did I spell that wrong? Oh, thanks. Too many D commands, thank you. Docker kill, and then you can see in Visual Studio it actually is giving me an error right away that says, hey, the debugger just stopped for some reason. And that's because that was that actual process that we were looking at. Cool. All right, so back to the slides. One of the other great things about .NET is the .NET Core and ASP.NET Core is that the .NET team has done quite a bit to try and support modern frameworks. There's an era at Microsoft that some of you might remember where the not invented here syndrome was prevalent. And if there was a solution that existed in the marketplace and it was open source, Microsoft would go try and invent some other version of it themselves. Now they've completely pivoted on that. If there's a good solution that is open source and loved by the community, they totally embrace it. And so things like Node and NPM are a big part of .NET Core. React and Angular both have project templates that you can use. There's lots of third-party templates for other things like Vue and other popular frameworks that you can download as extensions. But this is great if you're trying to create an application that's maybe partially server-side and partially a single-page application or SPA. You can now get those two things to work together very nicely with an ASP.NET Core application. Another great thing about ASP.NET Core is that it's been totally modularized. So it used to be that if you wanted to develop ASP.NET applications, you had to have the version of the .NET framework that you wanted to run against, right? And you also had to install some SDKs for ASP.NET. Now that's actually not the case anymore. ASP.NET is completely delivered to you as NuGet packages. And so you don't really install anything as far as creating ASP.NET Core applications. You just install the version of .NET Core that you want to use for the SDK. And then when you create a new project, you can either use a project template that includes the ASP.NET Core NuGet packages, or you could bring them in yourself. And that's going to be kind of equivalent either way. But it's totally modularized, which means it's really great that you don't have to have this like behemoth thing installed, this monolithic framework installed on all of your servers and all your development machines. Make sure that they're all the same version. you don't really have to worry about that stuff anymore because it's just NuGet packages. It'll be delivered at the time of a build, it'll be delivered at the time of a NuGet restore in Visual Studio, or it'll be delivered as part of the deployment if it's a server. This also allows really easy side-by-side deployment scenarios. If you have two different ASP.NET Core applications that live on the same server, you don't have to worry about upgrading ASP.NET Core on the machine and having it somehow break one of the old ones or something like that, because those NuGet packages just live in each of the different applications side by side. I mentioned .NET Standard before and how 2.0 was kind of revolutionary, so 250% more APIs than the previous version of .NET Standard. That's a lot, right? And if you think about .NET 4.7.2, which probably a lot of us, if we're .NET developers, are familiar with, kind of all the different APIs that are available in there, at least the ones that we use on a regular basis. Anything that you can really think of in there that's not Windows specific or UI framework specific is probably part of the .NET Standard base class library APIs, and therefore is also part of .NET Standard 2.0, which means it makes it really easy for you to create class libraries that kind of don't care what .NET they're running on. You could create a class library and compile it against .NET Standard, and then that .NET library or NuGet package will be able to run in a mono Xamarin application, or it'll be able to run in a Unity application, or against .NET Framework or .NET Core or UWP. It doesn't really matter, because as long as the framework that you're running it on implements that version of .NET Standard that you referenced, you've got that power of all those APIs available to you without having to even recompile that code. Huge change. Anybody done both MVC and Web API in ASP.NET before? Okay, so you guys all probably feel this pain, but in earlier versions before .NET Core, ASP.NET had two completely separate namespaces for Web API and for MVC applications. Frequently, those two applications would actually be one application, and so if you were inheriting from a controller class, you had to worry about which base controller class you were inheriting from. If you were using an authorize attribute on your controller class to secure it, you had to worry about which one of those you were using. Am I using the Web API one, or am I using the MVC one? So kind of silly, right? Because there's all this similarities between those two things, but they were really developed as two completely separate frameworks. And so in ASP.NET Core, all of that was merged together as early as 1.0. That created really a lot of nice reuse scenarios where it's a lot simpler to understand your code and it's a lot easier to maintain it. There was one kind of little caveat to that, which is that especially with model binding, which is the part of ASP.NET where the parameters that are coming into the methods in your controller are bound to stuff that's coming in on the request from the body or from the request URL. That model binding works just a little differently in an API project than it would work in a MVC project, because an MVC project focuses a lot on like form posts, right? And so because of that, Microsoft, in a more recent version of ASP.NET Core, they've given us this API controller attribute. So everything is totally merged together about those two, except for this one thing. If you mark up your controller class with the API controller attribute, it'll kind of change that whole controller over to use the binding conventions and a few other of the conventions related to APIs that you might want as defaults instead of the MVC defaults. Dependency injection, this is a huge one. Before this, in ASP.NET development, you usually had to bring your own dependency injection framework, either a third-party one or something you developed. And under the covers, ASP.NET 4 and before, we're not actually using dependency injection much at all, or really at all. Now, ASP.NET Core, under the covers, ASP actually uses dependency injection for all of its own components. And so you can just basically tap into that and use that for your components as well. But you'll actually see that when you're looking at an ASP.NET application, particularly in the startup. There'll be some services that are wired up for MVC or for other services that you might want to use. And literally all you're doing there is you're setting up dependency injection. So it's a very simple framework built into ASP.NET Core. It offers 3 different lifetime managements. Singleton, where obviously it's a single instance shared throughout the application. Request scoped, which is called scoped, which means it lives for the lifetime of the HTTP request. And then transient, meaning every time one of these is asked for, it's a new instance. That, I have found, that solves 95 to 98% of all scenarios that need to be solved. Some people have some very specific needs when it comes to dependency injection. They need to do some really complex logic on it. And if you need to do that and you are using a third-party framework that does that, chances are that framework has already been rewritten to hook into the existing framework that exists for DI in ASP.NET Core. So just go look at your DI framework's website and see if that's available, because the way Microsoft actually wrote that, they made it totally pluggable. So any provider could be swapped out at startup and use any different dependency injection framework you want. All right, Kestrel. This is one that really confuses people at first when they first start working with ASP.NET Core. So let me just kind of explain at a high level what the purpose of Kestrel is. Kestrel's job is basically to help decouple ASP.NET Core from any specific web server. So going back in time to ASP.NET 4.0 and before, anywhere in that world, we were really strongly coupled to IIS, right? We had web config files and stuff like that we had to use. And obviously, you could only run your ASP.NET application on Windows in IIS. Well, when Microsoft said we want to make .NET Core and ASP.NET Core cross-platform, obviously there needs to be some sort of a layer between the web server and the actual ASP.NET application. And so what Kestrel is kind of like a very simple container or a very simple web server, you could think of it as, that actually runs your ASP.NET Core application, regardless of what web server you might be putting in front of that. It's built for speed, so it's a very fast web server. It works very quickly on any platform, so you don't really have to worry about it adding overhead. One cool thing is you can expose Kestrel on the edge to the internet. It's not super battle tested yet because Microsoft hasn't been recommending that for very long yet, so I'm not sure I would suggest it. What most people do is they put it behind another web server and do what's called reverse proxying. And another really good reason to do that is that currently Kestrel, while it works really well at hosting an ASP.NET Core application, it doesn't do some of the things you kind of expect like a full-blown web server to be able to do, such as sharing ports for different websites. So if you want to have multiple websites that are both using using ports 80 and port 443 on the same server, you can't do that with Kestrel. Kestrel, one running ASP.NET Core application, can be bound to each port, and that's it. So if you basically have a web server in front of that reverse proxies for you, you can solve that problem. Another great thing that was introduced in ASP.NET Core, if you're still an MVC developer, if you don't do SPAs, but you do a lot more server-side development with MVC, there's this thing called tag helpers. Anybody using tag helpers in their application right now? Just a few, okay. Anybody never seen tag helpers in the wild before? Also just a few? Okay. So most of us are somewhere in between, or too shy to raise our hands. So let's look at a real simple example of what you might use a tag helper for. If you're familiar at all with SPA applications, with like AngularJS, for example, before the current version of Angular, use these things called directives, which is basically a way you could mark up your HTML code with something that was going to get created at runtime. And that's literally exactly what tag helpers do, except they do it on the server side. So let's actually look at one of those. I've got this tag helper project here, and I'm going to just open up my tag. Actually, let's go look first at the view. So I've got this layout CS.html here. This is actually just a file new project MVC template. But then I made one little change down here at the bottom in the footer. If I scroll over a little, you can see that there's an email tag with a mail to attribute set to support. If there's any HTML experts in the room, they probably know email is not an HTML5 tag. So what is that? And you can actually see that it's, maybe you can see it on on the screen there, it's colored a little different. It's a little more purple in Visual Studio versus the red of the script tag down here. And so basically what that is, that's telling me that this is actually a tag helper. This is actually something that's going to run server-side as code. And if I go look at the tag helper as I've defined it here, I've got my email tag helper. I've got a couple of, I've got a field called email domain, which is stirtrek.com. And then I've got a public property called mail2. And you can see that the tag helper automatically converted that camel case there to the more JavaScript or HTML-friendly mail-2, right? Just by capitalization. So that's my mail2 property. And then I've got this, you can see I'm inheriting from a tag helper, which has a process method that I need to override. So here's me overriding the process method. I get a couple of things passed to me. One of them is the tag helper context, which gives me information about what's going on with the request and the page and other things contextually. And then I get the tag helper output, which is where I can actually set and change the output of what this tag does. All right. And basically in here I'm saying output this tag as an A, or an anchor tag. And then I'm saying build an address using the mail2 and the email domain with an @ between. And then finally, set the href attribute on this to mail2 plus the address that we just built. And let's also set the content, or the text in between the begin and end tag. Let's set that as well to the email address. Okay, so now I'm going to change my startup project here to the tag helpers. And if we look carefully down here at the bottom, you can see it's created a mail2 link for me with a support@stirtrek.com email address. So if maybe I wanted that to come from configuration, if I wanted to be able to change that globally or something like that, I could do that very easily with this component. It basically generated some HTML for me on the server side at runtime programmatically, but it still looks in my HTML like HTML. Oops. All right, so let's go back here. Razor pages, this is something that was introduced in a later version of ASP.NET Core. You can kind of think of this as like halfway between web forms, if anyone's old enough to remember ASP.NET web forms, or ASP.NET MVC. It's page-based, so you kind of create the folder and file structure that's actually going to be visible to the user. So it's not controller and action method-based the way MVC is. Some have made the argument that it's a little bit more like an MVVM style design pattern versus MVC, which is obviously an MVC design pattern. So if you like the idea of having a little bit more direct one-to-one mapping between the paths of your files on your code and the paths that actually get displayed to the user, and being able to still use Razor and some of the modern stuff that's in ASP.NET Core, you might be interested in Razor pages. I talked a little about side-by-side versioning, so I won't go into this a lot more. This is also true, though, about not just ASP.NET, which is all NuGet-based, which makes it really easy to do side-by-side versioning. But this is also true of the .NET Core runtime as well. You can have .NET Core, different .NET Core versions installed at the machine level, but you can also have them installed at folder levels as well, so that you can basically have an application that's running on a server that doesn't have .NET installed, .NET Core installed, and it can still run by having .NET Core basically hosted in that folder, just the parts that you're actually using. Configuration has been totally redone. So this is probably one of those big things if you're moving from ASP.NET to ASP.NET Core. This is one of those big things that you kind of have to learn. Because we've gotten rid of IIS as a dependency, the web config file kind of isn't necessary anymore unless you want to have one and host it in IIS. But because of that, we can't really do our configuration in there anymore. We can't have connection strings or other configuration settings that we want to put in a web config file if a web config file isn't required. So to be a little bit more modern, Microsoft updated this by default to be a JSON-based standard. But that doesn't mean that you can't use other providers, you can use XML still, or you can use things like the Azure Key Vault. You can configure through command line when you run it. You can configure through environment variables. This is really useful if you want to put like a connection string on a server, on a production server, and make sure that connection string doesn't exist anywhere in your source code repository. This is a great way to do it. Just use the connection string from an environment variable. And then you can also have environment versions of your files that basically change your configuration depending on which environment it's running on. It makes it because it's JSON, it makes it much easier to do hierarchical settings. So if you want to group a bunch of settings together that are all related to your database under a property called database, and then have a nested object essentially in your settings, it's much easier to do that. And then also, configuration actually hooks into the dependency injection framework by using this IOptionsOfT interface. So in startup, you can actually create a strongly typed object that can hold a configuration setting or a chunk of configuration settings. And you can basically map that to a section of your configuration file. So you can say, load this object from this setting in the JSON file. And as long as the names and types all match, it'll get loaded in there at that time. And then anywhere in your code where you inject an IOptions of, and then for the T, use that type, that strongly typed configuration type you created, anywhere you do that, automatically the dependency injector is going to give you an instance of that object with all of those properties, all of those configuration properties set for you throughout your application. Logging is another thing that's been kind of redone and rethought. You can use either a bunch of different built-in providers for logging, or you can use some third-party ones. The third-party ones have some kind of interesting options, but a lot of what I need to do are actually often some of the built-in ones or the ones that Microsoft provided. So for example, when you're debugging, if you want to output to the Visual Studio debug window, you can set up debug logging console. That'll actually go to like standard output for your application. Event source, event log, and trace source are all kind of similar, and they also all kind of depend on which operating system you're running under. If you're running in Windows versus Mac versus Linux, those all kind of go to slightly different places, so I won't go into a lot of detail on those. Some really useful ones from Microsoft, especially if you're running in Azure. If you're using Application Insights, you can actually log your all your log events can be logged to Application Insights or to an Azure App Service. And then, like I mentioned, all of the big third-party logging suites like Elma, Log4Net, and Log, all of these provide a ASP.NET Core version of their logging framework that you can just hook in, and without really any special configuration, you're using their framework instead. So middleware is huge change to ASP.NET Core. If you're just kind of an MVC developer or an API developer and you don't think about the request and response and what happens to it before it gets to your controller class, then you might not care about middleware. But if you have ever written an HTTP module or HTTP handler before and hated every second of it, then you will love middleware. And actually, middleware makes it much easier to do some really fancy stuff in your application. So you can think of middleware as basically the request and response pipeline as a request is coming into your code and as it's leaving your typically controller code. There's a chance for some other things, some middleware elements to actually interact with that request. So when you do authentication, whether you know it or not, you're actually using middleware to do that. That intercepts a call and checks to see if it's in fact a valid authenticated request or not. When you have an error that bubbles up to the top and you get that kind of like nice looking error screen, that error screen is another one that's middleware. And this is all stuff that you configure in the startup class in ASP.NET Core in the configure method. So anything you see happening in there is probably middleware related. That also includes actually things like MVC. So MVC itself is a piece of middleware that just knows how to take a request, look it up in a routing table of sorts, and then map it to a specific controller instance and controller action method, and then do all of the model binding. So basically everything that you kind of use in ASP.NET Core now is middleware, whether you realize it or not. Let's look at a really quick example here of how easy it is to create. Okay, so I've got a middleware project. And basically, if I just open up this response time middleware, you can see here it's creating an X response time -ms header. That's the name. And if we kind of look down here at the invoke async, this is the actual like processing logic of the middleware. We can see that it's starting a stopwatch here, and then it's hooking up to an event on the response that's called onStarting, which might sound a little confusing, but what it says right here, if you can't read that, is it adds a delegate to be invoked just before request headers are sent to the client. So this is on the response. Just before the response gets sent back to the host, you can actually do something. And what's happening here, of course, is we're stopping the stopwatch, and then we're collecting the total elapsed milliseconds, and then basically altering the response to add that header with the response milliseconds as the value. And then this completed task, basically you either call that, which finishes things, or you can call this, which is what basically passes things down one level to the next middleware in the stack. So if you think of the request coming in, it's going to start the stopwatch, hook up this event handler, and then it's going to pass things down the chain to the next middleware. At some point, because this is an MVC application, it's going to finally hit our MVC middleware, which is going to run our controller, run our code, and then the response is going to come back up. As the response comes back up, you actually will get this event fired, right, when the response starts, and that's when the stopwatch gets stopped. So if we run this, let's open up the developer tools, and let's make it bigger. Okay, so I'm going to reload this page and click on it here, and if I scroll down to the response, hold on a second, let me try this. And of course, it looks like it is not working. Oh, you know what? It's because I'm running the wrong project. I've got to run the middleware project. You guys are supposed to watch for stuff like that. All right, so let's try that again. If I just load this page again and look at the response, now we can see the X response time MS, and we can see it took 32 milliseconds for this. So that was the kind of power that middleware allows you to basically alter any request or response as you see it going past, which can be very powerful for a web application. All right, so we've talked about all the great stuff. Now as we finish up here, I want to tell you some of the stuff that's still missing, just so that I give you a real complete picture. But I will say, I stand by my first slide, the yup that I gave you at the beginning, because there's really not a lot, and it feels a little bit like nitpicking some of the details here that are still missing. Hopefully you'll feel the same way. Anybody who's used EF6, Entity Framework 6, might be familiar with the TPT and the TPC pattern, the table per type and table per class pattern for inheritance. Most people who use Entity Framework are probably not familiar with those because it's kind of an advanced feature. Neither of those have been ported to Entity Framework Core yet. And then the other one that I think probably more people were using in EF6 is the many-to-many relationships without a join entity between them. Obviously, you can't do that in the database, but you can basically trick things out in Entity Framework 6 to make it look like there's no entity between a many-to-many relationship. And that is not supported in EF Core. And if I had to guess, I would say that probably never will be supported in EF Core. The reason for it is because it was kind of an early design decision not to go that way. Microsoft sort of felt like it was a big mistake that made a big mess of everything. And so they decided not to go that way in the beginning. Of course, now there's people who are like, hey, I would like that feature. And they basically, a whole development cycle, that is what they would have to use to just work on that feature, and it would touch essentially every other feature, which means it would probably slow things down, it would probably break some things. So my guess is that we won't see that again. There's a few other things that you see here, like currently creating models and updating models from existing database, using proxies as a way to track. That's not in EF Core. Some of the lifecycle hooks and some of the logging stuff is missing. A lot of these things are on the agenda to be developed, but currently don't exist in EF Core. If you're real fancy and you use HTTP 2, or if you're way too fancy and you're using 3, those aren't quite completely supported. So HTTP 2 is supported in ASP.NET Core, but it doesn't work on Mac OS. So that's just kind of like a caveat, just be aware of that. HTTP 3, which used to be called Quick, is not supported at all, but it is on the plans to be developed for a future version of ASP.NET Core. It's just not there yet. So if those are things that are important to you, those aren't in there yet. Web forms, any web forms developers that are willing to admit it? Okay, a couple of you, yeah, nice. Very brave of you to raise your hands. If you're a web form developer, that doesn't mean you necessarily love web forms, so I'm not going to accuse any of you who just raised your hands of loving it. But if you are somebody who loves web forms, this is also something I think is extremely unlikely to ever be ported over into ASP.NET Core. My recommendation to somebody who really loves web forms is maybe look at Razor Pages. It's probably the most similar pattern, but it's a little bit more modern technology. But I would also encourage them to look at things like SPA, single-page applications, and APIs as well, because that's probably a much stronger direction that things are headed in currently. A few other things. If you're familiar with the ACME protocol, which Let's Encrypt uses, it's kind of a short-term SSL renewal API for free SSL certificates that is supposed to kind of all work in the background and work automatically, so you don't have to panic that day when your SSL certificate breaks the whole site and your boss is saying, here's my credit card, buy a new one quick, right? This is supposed to kind of take all of that out of development and basically make SSL protocol-based certificate generation and application to websites automatic. There's a lot of people requesting this right now with ASP.NET Core, that it be actually a middleware, and right now it doesn't exist. Authorization of static files. If you have static files in your ASP.NET project and you want to somehow control access to them, you really can't put them in as static files. You have to put them somewhere else and write some sort of a wrapper code to access them and then stream them to the user, because the static files are not something that you can secure right now. In ASP.NET before, in IIS, you would just use the web config file and you could actually secure access to static files. You can't do that in ASP.NET Core currently. Caching does have a Redis implementation, but response caching currently does not have a Redis implementation. So if you're looking to cache your responses across multiple web servers in a single Redis cache, that's something that's currently missing. All right, so summing up a little bit, in my opinion, hopefully in yours now too, that I've given you some of my reasons, I think switching to ASP.NET Core is fairly low risk and high reward. It's a much more modern framework. It's all built as open source. It's cross-platform, which means you have a lot more options as far as where you develop and where you host. It's much more high performance. That maybe should be number 1 on my list. And then since 2.0 and .NET Standard 2.0 and ASP.NET 2.0, since basically the 2.0 versions of things, it's really stabilized a lot. If you were an early adopter like me, you went through some of those project.json changes and things like that. That seems to mostly be over now, and we're in a very stable situation with all the APIs that you could possibly want. And then the side-by-side versioning, this is really great if you're trying to host applications that are using different versions of the framework. All right, so I don't want to use this D word, so I turned it into sort of like a swear word. Everybody gets real scared when you use that word, but I want you to just be really aware that .NET Framework is in a different category now compared to .NET Core. You may have already noticed this, maybe even just with the .NET Talks at the conference today. You've noticed that .NET Core is where all the energy is at, and .NET Framework is not. So obviously .NET Framework is going to be around for a really long time. It's ubiquitous. It's on all of our Windows machines, and it's going to be supported for a long time by Microsoft for security patches and stuff. But I think what you can see happening is that new development is not really happening in .NET Framework anymore. New development is happening in .NET Core. So if you're starting a new greenfield project today or soon, my recommendation would be don't think about .NET Framework, think about .NET Core, which for the case of web applications means ASP.NET Core. And I would also watch Build for more information about this. I think there'll be some more information about the future, but I want to just call your attention to one piece of public information that you can get right now. If you go to the .NET Standard site and actually look at this table that shows you how .NET Standard versions map to versions of the different frameworks, you can see right here, all the way to the right, the NA with a 2 under 2.1 for .NET Framework there. And if you can read what it says in the very fine print at the bottom, it says .NET Framework will not support .NET Standard 2.1 or any later version. For details, see this blog post. So if you're interested in that, you should go to this page and read that blog post. But basically, what that's saying in the very fine print is you should not expect new APIs that are supported on .NET Core and Xamarin, which you can see all of those do have versions in the future that are going to support .NET Standard 2.1. You should not expect to see those things coming to .NET Framework. In fact, Beth Massey, who's the product marketing manager for the .NET platform, has recently said, we recommend that all new development that you start on .NET is on .NET Core. So if I haven't convinced you with everything else that I said today, hopefully these red letters push you in that direction a little bit. I'm often asked about the migration story, and what I basically say is that if you're doing something that does exist in ASP.NET Core, like MVC or Web API or a SPA application, you're probably going to be able to at least move your code over in chunks into a new project. There's going to be some different stuff as far as dependency injection and configuration and your startup class. Those things are going to be a little bit of a learning curve, and they're going to have to be manually intervened to get those things all set up correctly for your code. But there's probably a lot of code that you can move over and reuse without too much changes. But if you're talking about something like web forms, then the bad news is that there is no web forms in ASP.NET Core, and you really need to think about replacing it with something else like Razor Pages or something else more modern. All right, so you guys already gave $500, so thank you very much for costing me $500. I appreciate that. Hopefully a bunch of people will get some clean water because of this today, which makes it feel even more worth my time besides coming out here to share this stuff with you. And so that pretty much wraps up my time, but I will have a couple minutes for questions. So does anyone have any questions? Yes, right here in the front.
For projects that were done in .NET Core 2.0, and we want to go to 3.0, even though it might be another 6 months.
Yeah.
Do we have to do any migration or tweaking of the code?
Yeah, so the question is basically upgrading from .NET Core 2.0 to 3.0 and whether there's any significant changes there. And unless you're pretty much 99.9% no. There probably won't be any significant changes. Yeah, it's mostly new features in 3.0. Yep. Any other questions? Okay, we got a question coming from Slack. What will .NET Standard 2.1 include? Great question. So .NET Standard 2.1 is going to include a whole bunch of stuff that most developers won't care about, but unlocks some really low-level performance things about different .NET frameworks that .NET Core is currently using, and none of the other .NETs are using yet. And so it's really more for those .NETs to be able to come up to speed performance-wise. But by and large, there's really nothing in .NET Standard 2.1 that the average developer is going to care much about. All right, I'll be down here if anyone wants to come say hi or ask me any questions in person. I'd love to meet you. Thanks for coming.